Hello, this is the first lecture from GPY for 10, Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure. Our first week is focused on landscape ecology and sustainability and is based on the readings by Foreman and Gordon, Landscape Ecology Chapter 1, Landscape and Principles, and the article by Professor Wu, A Landscape Approach for Sustainability. Both readings are available on the Blackboard. In this first lecture, I will talk how landscape analysis is connected to sustainability science. We will define together what is a landscape and how sustainability, being a place-based concept, is rooted in landscape ecology. We would also define together what is sustainability and talk about strong versus weak sustainability models. We will also talk about the relevance of landscape scale and system thinking for sustainability planning, and culture-nature relationship defining human-environmental interactions. I will talk here about abiotic, biotic, and cultural elements of landscape, and landscape studies as a cornerstone of sustainability science. Can you define what is a landscape? And could you tell me what is it made of? Let's go outside. Let's explore Grand Valley campus or any place where you are right now. Go outside, take a book with you, the weather is great, and think about different concepts described in the chapter and find them in the landscape around you. Think how they're all interconnected. What is this landscape made of? Can you make a list of different elements? Can you describe what is this landscape? What is it about? Landscape analysis is both art and science. In fact, the term landscape is common to geography from landscape art or landscape paintings, the paintings of nature. And in this sense, the landscape can be viewed as an area or a part of the surface of the land that we can view at one time from one place, that we can take a picture of, we can paint it. However, in landscape ecology and in geography, landscape can be also understood as an area. It can be defined as a heterogeneous land area composed of clusters of interacting ecosystems. It can be also understood as a region or an area on the surface of the earth that includes landforms and vegetation and man-made attributes. So defined quite loosely, a landscape concept can mean several different things: nature, culture, technology, ideology, ecology, engineering structure, collective memories, history. All these can be linked to the meaning of the landscape. Tress and Tress propose a transdisciplinary landscape concept, suggesting that a landscape encompasses 5 different dimensions that are relevant for all landscapes. First of all, a landscape is a spatial entity. It is also associated to place and space. In the sense, landscape is deeply geographical. Geographers are thinking about landscapes as particular places or regions. At the same time, the landscape is also a mental construction. A landscape is something that we can think of, we can imagine, we can associate it with certain location and then bring certain memories or meaning or ideology or feelings associated with this particular place. We can also think of a landscape as a temporal concept. A landscape has its history, a landscape has its past and present and future. A landscape has its history. It's a way how we're thinking a history of a certain place. A landscape is also a nexus of nature and culture. It's a place of human-environmental interaction. A landscape is typically including both natural and man-made phenomena. And finally, a landscape is a complex system. A landscape incorporates many processes and components and elements, and in this sense, a landscape is a wonderful unit or a concept that is particularly useful for environmental problem solving and sustainability planning because it does allow this very interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary understanding of a particular place, of a particular landscape and everything which is inside of it. So I went for a walk and took a few pictures just to use them as an illustration of these 5 dimensions. As you can see, each landscape around us has its own pattern and it consists of specific elements for this area. We can use the landscape at a variety of different scales, but we would see the same elements. Here we are on the floodplain of Grand River just next to our campus, and you can see again that the same elements can be repeated at multiple scales. If you take a walk in the ravine, you would see a repetitive pattern of certain ecosystems that are present in this area. A landscape has its content, its structure. It's made of a variety of natural and man-made elements, and it has many meanings. We can think of it as a complex system. We can think of it as a unit that we can use for understanding sustainability and planning for environmental sustainability. Focusing on place and location and system thinking and environmental problem solving and being interdisciplinary, landscape approach is extremely relevant for sustainability studies and sustainable planning. Sustainability, of course, is another broadly interdisciplinary area of study dealing with environmental problem solving. We can think of sustainability as the way of meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future. And of course, this is a very difficult task. Very often we think in terms of the balance that sustainable system needs to meet, and this is the balance between economic, environmental, and social priorities that are also known as 3Ps: profit, planet, and people, or 3Es: environment, equity, and economics. Sometimes the literature on sustainability can be confusing, and it might give you an impression that these 3Es or 3Ps are equally relevant and have the same weight. We could think of sustainability in terms of the so-called weak sustainability model, suggesting that the society, the nature, and the economy all have the same importance. But is it really true? Can economy exist without society? Probably not. Can the society exist without the nature? Of course, no. The nature can exist without us, but we cannot exist without the nature. And certainly our society is much more than just economic development. It also includes equity and culture and so many other things. So it is more appropriate to think about sustainability using the strong sustainability model when nature or environment are really the primary component of the system, followed by the society, and then followed by the economy. In fact, we should think of the economy as just one part of the society, and the society as just one part of the nature. And in this sense, the landscape ecology and landscape analysis helps us to represent the strong sustainability model, starting with the nature and understanding that we are a part of the nature, we are a part of the natural environment. So the beauty of landscape analysis is that it really helps us to visualize and understand sustainability science, bringing together these 3 perspectives: environmental, social, and economic, with a clear understanding that environment is fundamental for the society and the society is fundamental for the economy. They are interconnected at the local, regional, and global scale, and the system can be only sustainable when it relies on environmental sustainability, on landscape sustainability at any of those scales. Landscape ecology, landscape analysis make a very important contribution to sustainability studies and sustainability science. They are central for understanding sustainable system because they bring conceptual and theoretical frameworks of thinking about sustainability, and they also bring important tools and techniques such as GIS and remote sensing and field research and field observations, helping us to measure and understand and analyze sustainability and link it to specific place and location and moment and time and define it at a particular scale. According to Professor Wu and his chapter on interdisciplinary pyramid of landscape ecology, a landscape is that unit that provides us with understanding of structure and function and dynamic and pattern and process and scale and hierarchy that are important for making decisions in conservation and management and planning and landscape design. And these decisions can happen through what he calls transdisciplinary research, which is the next step after interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, where scientists and citizens are coming together to make sustainability decisions. The United Nations Commission for Sustainable Development suggests that there are 4 rather than 3 dimensions of sustainability, including social, environmental, economic, and institutional. And once again, I want to emphasize that the landscape is providing this very important, very useful built-in block for mapping, measuring, and understanding sustainability. The UN Commission for Sustainable Development suggests that the indicators for sustainable development should be theme-based, so they're focusing on aspects of the atmosphere and climate and land and fresh water, and they should be focusing on human-environmental interactions. They should be scalable, hierarchical, inter-, multi-, and transdisciplinary. They should be holistic, integrative, place-based, and measurable. So you can clearly see how the concept of the landscape is extremely useful for all these 8 aspects of our conceptual framework of sustainability. As a unit for understanding sustainability, a landscape has its size and scale and complexity, and it is typically quite heterogeneous. That means it has many different elements, different types of surfaces in it. It combines abiotic and biotic and cultural elements. It can be a product of human-environmental interactions, while some landscapes can be more natural, some can be completely anthropogenic, but it's usually is a mix of everything. They have pattern and processes that are intimately related, and patterns that we see in the landscape can be indicative of certain processes that are happening there among the elements. Landscapes are hierarchical, they're scale dependent, and landscapes are fractals. That means that certain patterns of the landscape are repetitive at various scales. We can use a variety of different geographic techniques such as aerial photography and field research and satellite imagery and GIS and computer cartography to describe the landscapes. And that's why, again, all these methods that we can use for describing the landscapes can help us to understand sustainability at the landscape scale, at the local scale. So to sum up, a landscape is a basic spatial unit of human environmental interactions that is really a primary place of study in sustainability science. It also provides that perfect meeting ground for ecologists and geographers and anthropologists and engineers and policymakers that is so crucial for sustainability research and environmental problem solving. We need to have some common language. We need to have a multidimensional and multidisciplinary place to connect and bring all these different disciplines together. And finally, A landscape has its own range of scales, and the landscape scale is large enough to incorporate complexity of various environmental, economic, and social processes and their interactions. But it's also small enough, it's detailed enough to allow us in-depth studies and in-depth understanding that can lead to actionable solutions and implementation of those solutions at the landscape scale. So during the next few weeks, we are going to use this book, Landscape Ecology by Richard Foreman and Michelle Gordon. And this week we are reading the first chapter from this book, Landscape and Principles, and we will be learning about landscape mosaic or landscape pattern, which is the spatial organization of landscape elements. The landscape elements are those smallest units that make up the landscape that are always particularly organized in space in each type of the landscape. And they're kind of repetitive and they replicate themselves at various scales. We can think of the smallest possible land units that are still recognizable and still holistic, such as surface of water or parking lot or the ravine, maybe a wetland. It can be a patch of forest. It can be any kind of element of distinctive land cover that is relevant within the scale of your landscape. And what is the smallest unit really depends on the scale, because landscapes are fractals and they do replicate themselves at multiple scales, as we would see very soon. These landscape elements usually represent ecosystems from the ecological point of view. It can be a forest or a wetland or an agricultural field, but you can also think of them as any kind of land cover elements. That could be a building, that could be a parking lot, it can be any other man-made structure. It is not necessarily alive, it does not necessarily have ecological significance. Landscape pattern and elements are usually identifiable from the aerial photography or from the satellite imagery or from the bird view. If we could fly, or we can use a drone and fly over our campus, we would see the range of different landscape elements, different landscape features, and the size will be ranging from meters or feet to hundreds of kilometers. So again, there is no just one specific scales. There are multiple landscape scales where the landscape pattern is replicating itself. So like almost everything else in nature, landscapes are mathematical fractals, and what it means is that the same spatial pattern would repeat itself at whatever is the scale. And we can find fractals everywhere in nature. Think about the coastal line, think about the surface of the leaf of the tree, think about branches, think about the shape of plants, think of landforms, coastal line, the hydrographical features. All these are different examples of fractals. They're all self-replicating at multiple scales. And so this is true of almost any landscape. So a landscape always consists of a variety of different elements of different size and different functions. And so it's useful to think of landscape as a mosaic. And this mosaic arises from several major sources. There are three major sources of landscape mosaic or landscape heterogeneity. First of all, it's the heterogeneity of landforms. It's, of course, natural heterogeneity when we see valleys and hills and plains and mountains and all this variety of landforms associated with geological structures. And then on top of this landform heterogeneity, there is also biotic or biological heterogeneity that arises from different types of soils and vegetation, then further add complexity to the landscape mosaic. For example, within the same floodplain, we might find forest and meadow and wetland and maybe some water features. And then on top of all this, we see more and more human impact that is contributing to the landscape heterogeneity, which is further modifying all this physical and biological feature, adding many man-made features, for example, arable lands and parking lots and roads and buildings and gardens and so on and so forth. And so this heterogeneity in the landscape can arise either from the gradient or from mosaic. And we speak of mosaic when we can clearly identify individual landscape elements or ecotopes, like on this left side of the picture of an agricultural landscape where we can clearly see individual fragments. The landscape does look like a Roman mosaic. On the other hand, sometimes it's very unclear where these boundaries are. If we're thinking about the transition of the altitude in the slope or the depth of the ocean, or when we're thinking about gradual transition associated with either altitude or type of soils or types of vegetation linked to different conditions of humidity, we cannot really identify those specific boundaries of ecotopes, but we see gradual transition that we called gradient. As we describe the landscape, there are really three ways how we can think about heterogeneity and how we can represent it in the description of the landscape, on how we can map it. So the first and perhaps the most imperfect way is that we can pretend that there is really no heterogeneity, that the landscape is homogeneous. Let's say we know that the landscape consists of 65% as forest and 35% of something else, let's say arable lands and maybe buildings and something else, while we would simply can describe that this is a landscape that consists of 65% of forest, so it's a mixture of forest and arable lands. The other way, which is a little bit kind of better way of thinking of heterogeneity, is to view the space as a variable or heterogeneous, but without really regarding the special pattern of this. We can simply represent the landscape on our map saying that this landscape consists of 65% of forest and 35% of arable lands, but we really don't know how exactly this forest and arable land are interacting with each other in space. And finally, the most accurate and the most detailed way to portray heterogeneity would be to consider different patterns, different forms and elements of this non-homogeneous, heterogeneous landscape pattern, and we can actually show on the map where is forest and where is arable land, and perhaps there are some other ecotopes as well. So the way how we choose to address heterogeneity in one of these three ways really depends on the purpose of our landscape observation and the scale of those observations. And this is where the concept of grain is coming really handy. The grain is just the size of the individual unit of observation in a landscape, and grain determines relevant scale of landscape observation. It very much depends on the history of the landscape, the elements of the landscape, what were the driving forces that produced it. So if you think of the landscape of the Great Plains versus, let's say, the landscape of New England in the United States, or if you compare the landscape of Western Europe, places like UK or Western France, where you see very grainy, very fine-grained landscape versus very coarse-grained landscape in the Great Plains or in Eastern Europe, in Russia, you can really see how the history of land use have been shaping the pattern of the landscape. And so you really need to adjust the scale of observation to what is relevant to the landscape pattern of an area. So this concept of landscape grain is really important for choosing the right scale for our landscape observations, depending on the purpose of the project and also the pattern of the landscape in the area. because we can zoom in and zoom out, and depending on if we are kind of scaling up or scaling down our data, we can see very complex landscape pattern, or we can see much more simple landscape pattern, because we'll really see sort of the spatial clumping of different elements of the landscape, where instead of seeing many different small elements, they will be kind of aggregated and clumped together on in our observations, let's say on satellite imagery or on air photo. So our understanding of the landscape heterogeneity and types of the land cover types very much depends on the scale of observation and the grain of the element which is relevant at that particular scale. Regardless of what landscape you are in and what is the scale of your study, we can consider landscape heterogeneity in terms of three basic blocks of the landscape. These are patches, corridors, and matrix. So we're back to Grand Valley campus. Can you tell me what kind of landscape elements you can find here? What is the matrix? What kind of landscape patches do you see? What kind of the landscape corridors can you find as you are walking on campus? What is the level of landscape heterogeneity? And is it arising from mosaic or from gradient or both? Can you think of the typical grain of the landscape on campus? Would you recommend any particular scale which would be relevant for studying these landscape grains? What is the relevant scale of the observation? When it would be useful to zoom it in, and when it would be useful to zoom it out? Think of all these questions as you are exploring the landscapes around you, either on campus or off campus, and think of all the concepts that we have covered in this first chapter.